There are a few options for using grids and guides in After Effects to help line up your artwork. So the first thing to know is that this little button here is where you can find your grids and guides. So the first one is Title Action Safe, and that's just going to show you a good area where you want to keep your artwork within so that you can account for things getting cut off depending on what format you're using. If you're working in a composition that's a 16:9 ratio, like 1920 by 1080, using the Title Safe guide will show you the 4:3 aspect ratio within that. So that can be really helpful. Another thing that's helpful with Title Action Safe is that it gives you a nice center point. The keyboard shortcut for Title Action Safe is just the quotes key. Next on our list is proportional grid. And so this gives you a grid that's going to be proportional to the size of your composition. I find this grid really helpful to center things and evenly space things throughout a composition. The keyboard shortcut is Option and the quotes key. Next up is the grid, and this one is not always proportional depending on the size of your grid spacing and the size of your composition. So this one also has little subdivisions so you can really get down to the details with this. And the keyboard shortcut for this type of grid is Command and the apostrophe key. Now if you want to customize what your grid looks like, so maybe you want the spacing to be a little bit wider, you can go up to After Effects, Preferences, and then Grids and Guides. From here you have the option to even change the color if you're not seeing your grid clear enough. You can change how far spaced apart the grid lines are and how many subdivisions there are. You also have options for your proportional grid here. Next up is creating your own guidelines. In order to do this, you're going to need to bring up the rulers. So to do this, you can either use this drop down to bring up rulers, or the keyboard shortcut is Command R. Then if you drag out from the ruler, you can get your own guideline and place that wherever you want to on your composition. To show or hide your guides, you want to use Command and the semicolon key. Another option, if you aren't remembering the keyboard shortcuts, is to go up to View, and then you've got all of these options here. So you could lock your guides, clear your guides, or remember the keyboard shortcuts by looking over here. So I'm just going to clear those guides. You can also turn layers into guides. So for example, this color controls layer is just these three little squares that contain different colors that I'm using throughout my composition. And so I've set this to a guide layer, even though technically it's made of shape, so it's a shape layer. But you can see that this little hashtag symbol right here means that it's a guide layer. So in order to make a layer a guide layer, all you have to do is right click and then check guide layer on. And so what this means is that when I render this composition out, this layer will not be visible in my final render. Likewise, if I were to put this into another composition, you can see that those little squares up in the corner are not showing up, even though this jellyfish is the same one from this comp. Another tool to get in the habit of utilizing is markers. Markers are like leaving yourself little notes within your layers or compositions to give yourself information, so it's easier when you need to come back to your project later or just to line things up between one composition and another composition. So, for example, I've added these little markers to these different tentacle layers so that I know where the start of the loop is, and so that I can offset these tentacles so that they're not all moving in the same shape at the same time. So these markers help me offset the animation by just sliding the layers around. And I can see where the start of the loop is by the marker. So to create these markers on a specific layer, all you need to do is have the layer selected and hit Ctrl 8, and that will add the marker directly to the layer. If you want to delete a marker, just right click on it and you can delete all markers, just this marker. You could even lock your markers so that you don't accidentally move them, and then just hit delete. Also note that you can slide markers around by just clicking them and moving them. Now what if you wanted to put a marker on your entire composition, not just for a specific layer? So you can do that, and let's take this jellyfish example. Let's say when the jellyfish is about to start contracting its bell, or its main body, right about here, I want to put a marker on my composition, and that way when I move this composition into another composition so that I can have multiple jellyfish in the composition, I'll know where the contraction of the bell starts. So I have no layer selected. I'm just going to hit Control-8 on the keyboard, and that brings up a marker right on my top timeline panel. Then I'm going to go into a composition where I've combined, so I have multiple jellyfish in the composition. And you don't see that marker right away, but if you just select the layers, right click, go to markers, and then update markers from source, then it'll bring up those markers. So it might not automatically update if you add a marker and then later want to go see it. So if you're not seeing markers that you expect to be there, then that would be the step that you need to take. And then these markers can help me know when the contraction of the bell is happening so that the fastest part of this jellyfish's upward motion is happening right here. So I can kind of line that up with the graph editor and know that that's where that's happening because of this marker. If you forget the keyboard shortcut to make a marker, you can also just drag it out from the very right of your timeline. And if you double click on a marker, it'll bring up the settings, and you can even adjust the time, or you can leave a comment. So let's just say note. And you can also make the marker last more than just one frame. So let's say I set this to be 5 frames with the duration. So now this whole 5-frame area is marked here. And just double click on the marker if you want to go back and make changes. You can even change the color. In cases where you want to control a bunch of layers at once, it's helpful to use a null object. So if you go up to Layer, New, Null Object, it'll bring up this blank layer. It's basically nothing, but it's a layer that you can use to control other layers. So for instance, I could parent all of the jellyfish to this little invisible null layer. So I'm going to select all of the bigger jellyfish here and then parent them to the null object. And now if I move this null, all of the jellyfish go with it. So this could be helpful if I wanted to make all the jellyfish move at the same speed. And I could create another null object to move all the smaller jellyfish, which are presumably further away, at a different speed with a different null object. So this is just one simple example of how a null object can be helpful. Another quick tip for you is that if you want to unparent something from another layer, you can just command click on the pick whip, the little spiral here. And if you want to unparent multiple things, if you have them all selected and then you command click on one of the pick whips, they'll all unparent.